My number 4 best chess game of the 1970s is Pokojowczyk vs. Timoschenko from the Rubinstein Memorial of 1979. At the time this game was played, Pokojowczyk was a new IM. He got his title the year before, and unfortunately, he did pass away this year in 2020. Timoschenko, on the other hand, was a strong grandmaster, soon to be a trainer for Garry Kasparov. He's a specialist in the Sicilian defense, and he probably deserves some credit for some of Kasparov's Sicilian ideas across the years. This game is a classic Sicilian defense with aggression from both sides, but when White's attack does sputter, it is Timoschenko who does take over. The Sicilian in question here is a Scheveningen. That is the move 2e6, and later in follow-up, the move d6. Now, after d6, White is going to have the opportunity to play 6g4, the Keres attack. This is named after the great Paul Keres, one of the greatest players to never quite become world chess champion. Now, today, if you see a Scheveningen in the wild, and they are becoming less common thanks to the availability of more reputable Sicilians, you're probably going to see Black try to avoid this very dangerous move. It's not winning by force necessarily, but Black is definitely going to have to know what Black is doing, and even if you do know, White is going to have a lot of pressure. In this case, we see the follow-up Knight c6, g5, Knight d7. The displacement of the knight on f6 is a major theme and one of the problems for Black. And now bishop e3, pawn to a6, h4, bishop e7, queen d2, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, castles, castles, and b5. Now, obviously, I've zipped through a lot of theory here without comment. Suffice to say that this was cutting-edge theory at the time, but today there are recommendations from theorists and from engines. In any case, we get an interesting Sicilian position here, but it is definitely one that favors White. After all, White has advanced the pawns on the king side quite a bit already, thanks to the Keres attack. Again, why would you want to allow this if there are other options out there? And Black is under a lot of pressure, but it's a Sicilian. There's going to be some opportunity for counterplay later, and no one's going to play it perfectly. Speaking of not playing perfectly, in this position, White plays the overly cautious move, rook to g1. The idea is just to play h5 and g6. Great idea. The problem is that rook g1 to defend g5 before you do this is unnecessary. We are in an opposite sides castling position. In opposite sides castling positions, time is of the essence. You want to push forward as quickly as possible because if your attack does not get there first, your opponent's attack will. You also generally don't care too much about material in opposite sides of castling positions if you can gain some time, and you particularly don't care about the pawns that are blocking lines of attack going to your opponent's king. So you could have played h5 in this position, and if Black foolhardily captures on g5, then you just have h6. This is very strong. Now, of course, you're very happy to have an open g-file to attack with. You've got a mate threat here on g7 that is leading to some compromises from Black, and you can just capture the pawn on d6 to equalize the material in most cases. You're doing great. After the move rook g1, Black is able to play rook b8, and Black does have counterplay now coming with pawn to b4. h5, b4, and where is this knight on c3 to go? The modern engine recommendation is knight to a4, putting the knight on the edge of the board, but trying to block up the counterplay for Black. Now, this isn't even recommended, isn't even mentioned by Timoschenko in his notes to the game, probably because he didn't like putting a knight on the edge of the board. But again, engine recommendation today. What Timoschenko does recommend, the computer pokes a lot of holes in, but it's too creative for me not to show. I will not give computer critique. Knight to e2, pawn to e5, now queen to c4, knight to c5 with the clever idea that after bishop takes c5, the pin on the d file can be met by queen c7, and there's a pin on the c file in response. Black is able to win the piece back. White has the opportunity to choose how to give the piece back, though, and chooses knight d4 in this position, so both minor pieces are hanging, but you can only take one. And now pawn takes c5, knight to f5, bishop to e6, and Timoschenko recommends an exchange sacrifice here with rook to d5. Again, the computer pokes some holes, but I would certainly lose to this dangerous line of attack if I were playing with Black in this position. So, After b4, we should also point out that h6 looks a little bit dangerous thanks to the mate threat here, but after e5, 2 pieces are hanging and black wins a piece. But we can riff on that idea, and in fact white does so with the creative move knight to d5, with the point that after the capture of the knight, which is basically forced, you have h6, and you're going to win your piece back in this line. However, are you going to get quite as good of a position as you want after this move pawn to h6? First off, if black wants to try to keep the piece, the move would be pawn to f6. But after pawn to f6, queen takes d5 is winning. You can't go king h8 because of pawn takes check here, and after king takes, you can capture here with a double check that is just crushing. And if you go rook f7, white has a very, very creative and beautiful idea. It is pawn to g6, and then after pawn takes g6, you might want to pause your video to try to find the next move. Well, the cleanest move here is queen takes f7. Very, very beautiful, very brilliant. King takes, bishop c4 check, and the king is forced back to a square where it cannot stop the promotion of this pawn, either h7 or h takes g7. In this case, there's simply no way for black's many pieces that are held in the center and on the queen side to stop the pawn. It is quite humiliating. After h6, though, black does play the accurate move knight to e5, the only available option, and now pawn to f4. The idea of queen takes g7 mate, of course, means that the knight can't move and white is winning the piece back. But after queen c7, the best move in the position, there is additional support for e5. So after captures and captures, black is doing okay. How is white to play this position? Probably best was the move pawn g6, which is very, very complicated. I'm not really going to unpack it. You can check out the notes if you want to know more about that move. But in the game, white plays e takes d5, choosing not to capture on e5 yet, which is probably a good choice, but this move does allow bishop f5. After bishop f5, there is an immediate mate threat on c2. Black has created their first threat of the game, and basically from here on out, black is just going to make threats with each move. Now rook g2 to defend the mate threat, rook to c8 to threaten bishop takes c2, and then things like bishop e4, rook d to d2 to defend c2 again, and now pawn to b3, an excellent move. After the capture of that pawn, you get rook takes b3, and this rook is threatening a lot of things. Sometimes queen takes or rook takes e3, and in general, black's pieces are just hopping on the white position, and white still hasn't won a piece back. If at this point you do capture the knight back with pawn takes on e5, there is pawn takes e5, queen to a7, queen to a5. This threatens, of course, queen to a1, and you might here consider the move queen takes a6, but then black has the very pretty rook takes c2, rook takes queen e1 mate. Very nice indeed. If after queen a5 the king tries to run for it right away here, you are threatening the rook and you are threatening the bishop. But after rook takes b2, queen takes on e7, rook b1 check, there is queen to b5, and black is winning material here, either on f1 or after rook d3 on d3, thanks to e4, attacking the pinned piece. This is just decisive, of course. So after rook takes b3, we get king d1, a move that is given an exclamation mark by Timoschenko as being the most resourceful move. Now the knight is again under attack, and the rook is under attack. At this point, there is a simpler move than what Timoschenko played. Black could play the move rook takes e3. Now, after rook takes e3, queen takes e3, black is equal in material and has two minor pieces for a rook and a pawn, but this is a position where those two minor pieces are just crushing it. I kind of wonder if Timoschenko had hallucinated for a moment and thought his knight was trapped. Oh no, my knight is trapped. But anyway, knight g6 is just fine. And in this case, again, the two minor pieces should win. So this was relatively simple, and I'm kind of surprised Timoschenko didn't go for it. But I'm also grateful that Timoschenko didn't go for it because he played instead the very brilliant move bishop to f6. He is insisting on placing pieces on prise. The first point here, and basically none of the pieces can be captured, is that if you capture the bishop that has just been placed on prise, there is no mate on g7. This diagonal has been blocked, so knight f3 is now possible. And this move with a fork on the queen and on the rook is decisive. After the queen moves, you just pull back with rook b7, and you're going to capture here, and you're up in exchange, and of course white's king is too exposed. You can also consider, of course, capturing the knight on e5, pawn takes on e5, but then you have bishop takes e5, again queen a7, always met by rook b7, no queen trade, thank you very much. And this position is actually, again, one where there's equal material on the board, but black's attack is just too strong. There's no attack on this king, and there's a lot of attack on this king. It is decisive. So, of course, after bishop f6, this rook is also hanging, and that is what Pokojowczyk captures, which is the correct decision. You should capture as much material as possible when you're coming under a huge attack. And after this, he is up in exchange, which is nice. So, pawn takes b3, queen c1 check, king to e2, and now knight to f3. Another very pretty, very visual move. This is a double attack here on the queen, so the queen needs to move. Where should she go? Well, the best place for the queen to go is a4. This covers e8. In this case, after knight takes d2, bishop takes d2, the lack of rook e8 check, which would have been very strong, means that black has to go for bishop d3 check, king takes, and queen takes on f1. Now, the king is still not safe. This is certainly a position that is much, much, much better for black, but it is a position that a lot of exchanges have occurred in, so it's going to be difficult to prove a win here. This is the best opportunity that white has had in a long time. Instead, after knight f3, the queen goes to b4, and here we get rook to e8. This is the strongest move, and it threatens queen to e1 and queen takes e3 mate. Of course, that would happen if you captured the bishop on f6. Game over, GGO. Instead, after rook e8, we see king takes f3, taking the knight instead, but that allows the capture of the bishop on f1, queen takes f1, bishop f2, and bishop e4 here would force white to give up the queen. This is probably a position that white does win, but a better move is queen to h1 as played in the game. The idea is queen to h5, king g3, and queen to h3 mate. After queen h1, in this position, one idea that I love is bishop g3 when there's only one really crushing move. It is the move pawn to g6, with a very sneaky idea that is revealed after pawn takes f6. Bishop g4, and it was very, very hard for white to stop this move. There was no good way to do it. King takes and queen h5, a beautiful mate prepared by the move pawn to g6. In the game, after queen h1, we actually see the move bishop to g1, and now queen h3 check, rook to g3, queen to f1 check, and here you can block on f2 in two ways. If the bishop blocks, there is queen h1 check, rook back, and now queen h5, king g3, queen h3, another nice mate. And after rook f2, this is a great moment to pause your video and figure out the closing combination. It is rook to e3, very beautiful, a decoy sacrifice to pull the king over so that after king takes e3, there is queen d3 and mate on the board. After rook e3 check, black did, or white did resign without allowing this final mate, but I'm going to leave it here, of course. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. If you want to see another great game by Timoschenko, but a different Timoschenko in the Sicilian Defense, then you can click on the video that's popping up in the corner. And of course, I have more games from the best of the 70s list, games I've already covered and games I will soon cover, so check out that playlist as well.